Good morning, everybody. It's very good to see you all. On my way here, I was reading a book about how to keep calm. And it was a beautiful book because it said you must spend more time with people who give you positive energy. And so it's with great pleasure that I've spent almost a day coming here to be with somebody who I believe gives a great deal of positive energy. And Gilles and colleagues here are like-minded professional soulmates, part of a group of the International Society of Social Pediatrics and Child Health. And I thank you very much, Gilles, for inviting me to speak on this topic. So I'm going to say something about going from the case to a program to implementation, and just touch on some of those themes that you've already heard already. And I start with a quote that some of you may have seen already. This could have come from a newspaper yesterday. Our youth loves luxury, has bad manners, disregards authority, and has no respect whatsoever for age. Our today's children are tyrants. They do not get up when an elderly man enters the room. They talk back to their parents. They are just very bad. Not a new problem. So, as I was introduced, the last time I was in Nottingham was 20 years ago. I've been a professor of pediatrics at Imperial College for the last 20 years. But when I was in Nottingham, I spent 8 years at this special school, Westbury School, described as those children who are bad, mad, or sad. So this was a group of 30, 35 children, extremely vulnerable, often excluded from school because of their difficulties. And I just wanted to say something a little bit about a case, Jack, who's about a typical child, about 9 or 10 years old in this school, with a number of problems that you'll be very familiar with, a number of different problems with different etiologies, asthma, enuresis, aggression, attentional difficulties. This must be a very familiar child to many of you in this room. Multiple placements in different foster families, etc. Jack is very typical of children who are often labeled as naughty children, often have terrible low self-esteem, are very angry, often excluded from their social peer groups. It's not much fun going to school, so you don't attend school. And because you don't attend school very well, you fail academically. You get into truancy and petty crime, poor job prospects, often unstable relationships, leading to poor parenting skills, and the cycle keeps turning. And that would be a very typical scenario in this school. Interestingly enough, there were some wonderful exceptions of children, and that would be a topic for another lecture, of children who are so resilient in these circumstances they broke through and actually were extremely successful in their own right. But typically that would be the pattern. Well, a very good colleague of mine, a lecturer of mine called Honey Heusler, who's now working in Australia, and I looked at their case records in great detail. We were very interested to know what happened to these children in their early lives. And this was a very long time ago now. This is about 25 years ago, well before the Centre for the Developing Child had come up with adverse childhood experiences research. And what you see here is a list of issues that have been picked out from the case notes of these children. And you see they're a highly mobile group of children, often a very great discontinuity of care, a lot of sensory issues, failures to attend health professional appointments, very high levels of maternal depression, moving a lot, moving schools and homes, and this would be not atypical. About 2/3 of them had poor growth in the first 12 months. Intact in families were rare. Domestic violence recorded in almost 50%. Interestingly, this group, sudden infant death in the siblings, occurring in 1 in 10 in these children, which is extremely high. So this is so some of those will no doubt have not been sudden infant death. They were more likely to have been murdered. So these are extremely interesting children with known police involvement in about half of them. So this is the sort of families that Jerry's team would be seeing, or many would be seeing in their day-to-day practice. What is quite interesting from this is if we look at, and I thought Melanie might touch on this, but if we look at those risk factors and we look at the likelihood of developmental delays, you can see from this graph the number of risk factors, the greater the number, the greater the risk of adverse development. This audience will know this well. But perhaps less so is the fact that this impacts so much later on in one's life, in adult life. So the more adverse experiences in childhood, the higher risk of alcohol or illicit drug use. Or for that matter, adult depression or cardiovascular disease, adult heart disease, and this is well known. So this really made me think very hard about my career, about spending 8 years in a school like this every 2 weeks with that sort of background, and then dedicating the rest of my career very much to early intervention programs. Now, Jerry talked about context, and one of the things I think that's very interesting, talking to Gilles before we started, was he's written a book about decoding, the understanding the child and the context. And to develop this into a clinical tool has been a very interesting challenge for me, partly because causality is so complex now. That first diagram here shows a typical simplistic germ causes disease type causal pathway. The sort of causal pathways these children have are incredibly complex, interrelated, very, very difficult to establish. Many people have put together frameworks for how the genes interact with the socioeconomic and psychosocial, how important friendships and families are within that very complex causal framework that leads to different events occurring during a life course. And that sort of framework can be used in lots of ways, both for policy, for etiology, clearly for etiology here, for interventions policy, and for advocacy. A very useful framework developed by Lynch in Australia. But how could we actually convert something like that into a clinical tool? So a colleague of mine, Rashmin Tamni, and myself looked at this concept of the mandala. And this is a drawing that is often used in Sanskrit or African art to indicate interrelatedness in a complex system. And from Canada, Trevor Hancock published some years ago, about 30 years ago, this concept of using this model, the mandala of health, as a human ecosystem, where you have the relationships between the various components affecting or impacting on the child or the patient in the middle. Community and lifestyle, very important. Human-made environment, just as important. But could we actually use that as a clinical tool? So Rashmin and I put together a clinical tool which actually goes against several thousand years of of taking a clinical history. So doctors are trained to take a story from their patients in a particular way. But this was actually saying to doctors, why don't you use a completely blank framework that puts the child very much at the center of a complex, interactive system with lifestyle, physical environment, social networks as very much part of that framework, and use that as a clinical record to start integrating the biological, psychological, and social information. It is a very useful tool because it involves the child. So we do this in our clinical practice with the child and the family, and we complete something using a standardized notation. And if anybody's interested, I can send you the manual and you can have a go yourself. I don't have enough time to explain in detail the symbols, but this is a very complex family situation with John right in the middle of it, with a complex physical environment of his home, where you can identify the negative or risk factors as well as the positive risk factors in the family. So in this case, the mother, depressed and isolated, asthma and eczema as some of the key issues, but some of the protective elements for John in this case are his brother, who happens to share a room with him, and his social worker, Andrea, who has a very good relationship with him personally. So it gives actually a nice snapshot clinically of the different interactions. And for the older child, they're able to put themselves in the center and describe the emotional map that they have, the emotions that they have with this. So we ask children to draw a diagram with them in the center, to describe the things that make them cross or sad or worried, things that make them happy, things that they would like to wish to change. And this would be a good example of a case here. And this boy completed this bioecogram on his own and came back to my clinic to then decode that for me. And this was, I thought, a very useful and practical example of decoding in clinical practice. And just to finish off, going from the case to the sort of clinical tools that one might use to the programs that you've heard Melanie talk about, we are moving very much from a 20th century organization-orientated health system, which is based on primary, secondary, and tertiary care, to a venue-orientated concept of delivery. And this is not a new idea, but is one that is taking hold, I think, in many different countries, including my own. So that you have more and more cases of wraparound services. Different programs exist in different areas. This is after Neil Halfon's work. And it's about trying to bring some of those programs together under one roof. And he talks about the Family Resource Center, and I think in a sense many of us are striving for a very similar concept of this, the wraparound type of service. Adrienne is going to give me a 1-minute warning, 2-minute warning, good. So, and in this wraparound service, and you'll be very familiar with this idea because you are doing, the foundation is doing something very similar for a much wider age group. And we've talked in the UK about integrated care and a set of different teams, integrated teams working at different ages, with the health teams working very intimately with outside bodies, both in the early years, in the school age, and in adolescent age groups. Two colleagues in Sweden, Gabriel Ottoman and Stephen Lucas, have recently presented a very interesting medical home model for children and adolescents in the out-of-home care. And why I wanted to present this to you in the last minute or so is the very interesting analogy made between transplant services and social transplantation. And I like this analogy a lot, and with their permission, I want to just share it with you. Organ transplantation requires complete investigation of the medical condition. Social transplantation has a variable completeness of investigation. Organ transplantation has meticulous matching of donors and recipients, but social transplantation often requires an emergency search for available foster homes. Organ transplantation have large teams with many experts, few specialized centers of excellence. Social transplantation often left to junior workers in many municipalities, the least experienced. Careful follow-up to ensure graft and recipient are compatible in organ transplantation, whereas you get sparse follow-up with inadequate services for children and families. And finally, longitudinal perspectives with the former, with organ transplantation, but often a failure to consider long-term perspectives in social transplantation. A very interesting analogy. And they've set up their service to do just that, to take a team approach, highly expert, very, very collaborative, social care, health care, psychological assessments, with 2-year follow-up, and a very, very strong emphasis on handover between placements. So there is continuity of this team when the child goes to a different placement. Melanie's covered this, so I will leave this for now, but this is really about reminding us about the importance of collective impact, a common agenda, a shared measurement system, but often requiring an independent organization to help support it. And I'm going to finish with 2 slides. Just to remind us, this is from the first woman doctor. We're not tinkers who merely patch and mend what is broken. We must be watchmen, guardians of the life and the health of our generation, so that stronger and more able generations may come after. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the panel. Thank you.